Hello, everyone. Jason Hagcomb here, and I am joined today by the man of many talents working for many outlets, including his own newsletter, Jack Wannan. You can catch him on Post Wrestling. He'll be actually recapping what we're about to talk about here, the UFC 300 card, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon with John Pollock on Post Wrestling. But here we're going to break down this massive, the deepest UFC card, really of all time. Here on this breakdown. Well, so first of all, Jack, nice to actually meet you for the first time.
Yes, Jason, long-time listener, first-time caller. I'm ready to talk fights with you today.
Yeah, we're going to talk some fights. We're going to break down this UFC 300 card. But first and foremost, as every outlet seems to be talking about this in the combat sports space, Jack, obviously AEW last night, they aired the backstage footage from the All-In event in August with CM Punk and Jack Perry. What is your takeaway from an incident that I think does more harm than good for All Elite Wrestling?
My takeaway is I don't really have a takeaway. I mean, going into this, there was so much hype around. Was this video going to show us that we didn't know? Is it going to expose something about CM Punk or something about the fight that we maybe haven't heard yet? Especially since the non-CM Punk side of things has been pretty hush about the entire situation. And we kind of got a video that, barring a few small details that have been said incorrectly, we kind of got what we knew about the situation. And my reaction after watching it was, okay. I was sort of surprised that they aired this, and I was a little confused with what they were trying to accomplish. I think that the underwhelming value of the video made it a very head-scratching moment, and one that people are really going to question in the weeks ahead. I feel like I don't really know how much this does for the FTR Young Bucks storyline they're trying to attach to this story, especially since the way they're telling the story is really, really trying to link these two things that are not linked at all. The Young Bucks saying that they had to deal with this situation backstage as EVPs that took them out of their match, and slightly linking FTR to it because of FTR's relationship with Punk. And the entire situation, it just doesn't make too much sense to me. I know that they need to find something fresh to push the FTR Bucks storyline since they've faced so many times before, but I just didn't really understand doing this, especially now that we know what the video was. I think that there are people out there who are going to blow this out proportions on a pro WWE or pro AEW side. I don't really take sides about this. I just sort of thought it was kind of underwhelming. My wholesome take about it, the take that I want to push out into the world, is that hopefully the video being underwhelming will make people move on. Like, I am so sick of hearing about this situation. When it came back after the Punk interview a couple weeks ago, I was like, I don't want to deal with this all again. And that thing airing on Wednesday probably means that people are going to talk about it even more, even though my takeaway from that video was, I'm done talking about it.
Yeah, my takeaway is obviously you shouldn't have aired this because it makes you look bad for you hyped up this grand video, basically making the video seem like, CM Punk's gonna be like Ron Artest at the Malice at the Palace, where he caused this whole situation. People were hurt, people were knocked down, punches were thrown. You can see why Tony Khan would say he feared for his life. And then the altercation, maybe with some facts that Punk got wrong when he was on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani, where saying Jack Perry started it, where it was really him initiating the push, which obviously you shouldn't do. But to say that caused Tony Khan to fear for his life, that's a little bit of a question mark. Does this help your product in the long run? No. The biggest point was to focus on a guy that's not even here anymore and has moved on and seems so much more happy in the competitor right now. And AEW just devoting time out of their television show to focus on an incident that doesn't need to be focused on there, where they need to be focused on creating stars and continuing to build to a pay-per-view that they have in 2 weeks. I just don't think this did any good for AEW, and just really continues to hurt their narrative, which right now, as what seems, Jack, right now at an all-time low for them.
I don't know. I mean, I think that there are some people who think that controversy is a way that can benefit everyone, that especially since this is an issue where people are siding with AEW and people are siding with WWE. Personally, this type of stuff doesn't interest me too much in wrestling. I think that it would be better if the product was just more focused on creating storylines instead of trying to piggy bank off of things that are being run in, more gossip circles.
I mean, obviously, things like these are going to happen because I think the biggest success that we're seeing in WWE is blending reality with storyline. But to do it this way, just be like, here it is. Like, I even thought when the Young Bucks were cutting their promo, I thought, okay, a little creative way to say why they lost their match at All In, because they were being actually executive vice presidents and having to focus away from their match due to this situation. Like, okay, that was fine. But then you forget all about it in 2 minutes once they air the footage, and it's so underwhelming for what they hyped up. Obviously, that's an issue for AEW now to have to worry about. Hopefully they can find they're doing good things on their TV too, as we were talking off air. Like, their past few weeks of television have been really great. They're building up this, I think, very entertaining title match with Samoa Joe and Swerve Strickland. Why do this? Just focus on yourself and create your own content, create your own entertainment, and don't get hurt by what comments people are making in the media about your company. And then you're taking valuable TV time to shine light on the competition.
Yeah, I think it was a bad moment, and I think unfortunately what even sort of like brought it up even more in relevance was the fact that it was on a show that I don't think people really enjoyed too much. I haven't had the chance to watch the entire episode yet. Unfortunately, I think that the positive for AEW with this is a thing that was a blemish on them last night, but if they can just move on from this, it's going to be something that people are going to stop talking about. I mean, if you can really turn things around and produce a really great show next week, people are going to say, what the hell was going on last week? But hey, at least we have this product which is good this week and, could be even better moving forward.
Well, we'll move away from this hot button issue in the world of professional wrestling to focus on the hot button issue right now in the realm of mixed martial arts, Jack. It's the UFC 300 week. UFC's branding is the deepest and the best card they've ever put together. And when you look at this card, there's some truth to that, especially for the talent and the number of former champions, and including a former champion that's going to be opening this card in Davison Figueiredo. But Jack, my first question for you involving this show, it's a massive show, massive number. How excited are you for UFC 300? Because I don't feel like the buzz is there as we saw for UFC 100, 200, and now going here into UFC 300.
Well, I think that just to start, UFC 300 is easily one of the strongest cards, top to bottom, of all time. And there's really, it's hard to debate that. But I think what's interesting is that the approach in the matchmaking on this card is so different compared to the 100, 200, or just any big UFC card that you use as an example. And I wrote about this in a column recently, how it feels like UFC with this event is less promoting a big fight on top of their celebratory card, but instead just one really start to finish big show. And that's for hardcore fans, for even casual MMA fans that will watch once a month or twice a month. That's an amazing thing, and they're really going to eat that up and enjoy that. But you just don't get that similar hype that you get when there's one really huge fight on the top of a card. I think that logistics, taking into account who was available, who could and couldn't fight, they really couldn't get that huge fight for this card. So I think this was a shift in their marketing to adapt to really what they were able to do. When you think about, how John Jones still isn't ready, how a lot of the other big champions that have name value weren't ready. So I think that the approach was really to focus this on how can we make this a start to finish stellar card instead of saying, hey, we have a great card for you, and by the way, we have this incredible main event that you're not going to want to miss. And I think those are the types of cards that get that mainstream attention. They get, your friend who doesn't watch MMA but knows you watch MMA and goes up to you and says, hey, tell me about this fight card. Those are the type of cards where you get that type of interaction with your friends. I don't think... Sorry.
To your point. Now, Jack, to your point, obviously there's a lot of names that weren't available. They were hyping up this main event to be this spectacular fight that we had to wait on bated breath. But there was a guy that is available and was chomping at the bit to come back, and that's Conor McGregor, a guy that we just last saw him doing the press stuff for the Roadhouse movie. That's the most watched movie on Prime. He seemed like he was ready and willing to go, but the UFC was just so not willing to put arguably the biggest star in the history of this sport on there. I think, do you feel like that's a bit of a miss too? Because I think they're just feeling that UFC, that the 300 number is going to draw as much as any individual fighter was, as they're trying to take back control, as opposed to when Conor was like kind of having that peak run in 2016 where he felt bigger than the brand.
Yeah, well, you make that interesting point about the brand being the thing promoted. And one thing I wrote about is just how damning it was that the poster for this event is just the logo. There's no fighters on it. They're not selling you Alex Pereira or Zhang Weili or Justin Gaethje or Max Holloway. They're selling you UFC. And they think that for people walking by bars that will see that poster on the window, or who are seeing, ads on the internet, that name value of the brand is going to get you in the door alone. Now, when it comes to Conor McGregor stuff, it is just so hard to truly know what is up with him. I think that there is so much politicking with his fights of how to get them done and where to get them done. Is there a world where I think Conor McGregor was completely busy, completely ready to fight, and UFC decided not to put him on the card? I think that's totally possible. But I think there's also other worlds out there that are also possible where a fight couldn't be made for this card. And, it's something I'm open to, being a possibility, but it just always feels like there's so many things at play with Conor McGregor fights. And there's all these times where, they say they want to get him on this card, and they try to, he says he wants to be on this card, and it doesn't end up working out. We had that whole issue with USADA last year where him entering the testing pool essentially made it so that 2023 was a no-go for him.
Yeah.
And now we're in 2024, and we're more than a year out from when him versus Chandler was first discussed, and we still don't really know when that fight's going to happen. Not to sound like a fence sitter, but I just feel like there's so many things with McGregor that you just never know about. It's possible that they should have put him on this card, but I feel like the jury's kind of out on that.
Well, there's still hopefully the speculation he will fight on International Fight Week at the end of June for UFC 303.
Yeah, and that's the date that on I think New Year's Day or New Year's Eve he was teasing that
Yes.
date. So I think that's the one to watch, honestly.
I think we'll watch for that, but he did seem very ready to go here for UFC 300, and maybe you needed that extra spice, because I think this will kind of transition to, as we look at our first fight here, the main event. Dana White was hyping up this main event as like the greatest thing since sliced bread. He's getting the fan base hyped up through social media and around like, oh, what could it be? Are they bringing a star back? What is this fight? And then it's like, oh, we're getting Alex Pereira and Jamal Hill. Like, a great fight, but UFC 300 level? I don't know about that. And I think that's what kind of maybe sunk some of the sales here of this card and the buzz for sure. It's deep, but it doesn't have that name value. Is Pereira maybe a guy creating that run and becoming like a Mike Tyson level kind of fighter with his knockout ability, but he's still not there, doesn't speak English. It just seems like this announcement kind of hurt, I think, the promotion for this event when they announced it, back in January, February.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a solid main event, and this is one that, I mean, probably the best you could make at light heavyweight currently. Alex Pereira, certainly, he has name value. He is one of those guys where in MMA circles, he is one of the most popular names. I don't think he's, fully broken that ceiling of being a star outside of MMA. I think that his fights against Israel Adesanya were obviously a huge deal, especially beating him and getting that rematch. And I think that if they were to do another fight in the future, it would be a huge deal. But I think that, when you put him against other people, the Alex Pereira buzz isn't enough to carry a fight into being a super huge deal. With that being said, though, I do think this is a really solid fight, and I really am interested to see, like, just from a storytelling standpoint, this is a really interesting fight to make, even if it doesn't have that mainstream value. You have Hill, who never lost his title, and Pereira, who now has the title. It's perfect storytelling. It's almost something you would see in like a wrestling card. The idea of, you kind of saw that like on NXT last week with Roxanne Perez, where, she lost her title in a ladder match. So she was kind of like, or like a 6-way match. So she was like, okay, well, I never really lost the title. It's kind of what you have here, but even a more tragic situation, because Hill was injured not even in training. He was injured outside of training, and that's what ended his title reign. Now he's another
pickup basketball, I believe it was.
I think that's what it was. Yeah, and that's
pickup basketball took the UFC light heavyweight title away from Jamal Hill, and I think that's one of the biggest questions about this fight. Is we know what Pereira can do. He looks very good at this light heavyweight weight class, and it seems like this is the weight class he wants to stay at. but Jamal Hill's making a relatively quick recovery from a very serious injury in that ruptured Achilles, where a lot of athletes are never the same again, obviously, after this injury. And he's making, as we said, that quick return. How do you see Jamal Hill being in this fight? This is a very heavy-handed striker, but you need to use that footwork and good movement to have those angles to find a way to beat Pereira.
Well, I think that I was looking at the odds, and I'm not a gambling person, but I think the odds can really tell you just where the public or where experts really see a fight. I was really surprised by how close the odds were on this fight. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I think there's just so many questions and so many unknown factors about this fight heading into it. I think that Pereira obviously has to be considered the better striker heading into this, but how do all of the other factors about Hill's game affect Pereira? And also, Hill in his first appearance post-injury, how will that affect him? We have no clue. We didn't see a tune-up fight for him facing someone else, nor should he have gotten that, to be fair. But we are going to be seeing Jamal Hill for the very first time since that injury, and we have zero clue what that could produce. There are so many questions around this. I personally think I have to favor Pereira. I just think his striking allows him to do better against most guys. I think he's, one of the most dangerous guys at light heavyweight. And even guys who are able to, give him challenges in other aspects of the fight, he's able to manage himself well enough to get those wins. With that being said, though, I totally respect that this is a close fight. And if Hill were to win on the weekend, I wouldn't be calling this a major upset or anything.
I think I would call it a major upset just for the quality of opponent that Jamal Hill would beat, and on the recovery of an injury that, Aaron Rodgers is the biggest sports star we saw have this injury that thought, he could come back super early. Obviously that didn't happen, but this is a major injury, and leg kicks are a big part of mixed martial arts.
That's
and
true.
I can definitely that could be a game plan here for Pereira to use those kickboxing level kicks to the leg here. And how will Hill take those leg kicks? Like, that's something. But I think if Pereira gets crazy, as a quality of a striker is, Hill is one of the best strikers here in this division. He can find a way he can land that shot that we saw in Israel. Adesanya landed at 185 pounds here, up a weight class. I think Hill would have a great chance. I think this would be one of the biggest stories coming out of this UFC 300 event. If Jamal Hill can not only come back from what looked like a career-ending injury or definitely career-altering injury, to regain a title he never lost would be massive. As we transition through here, Jack, I think this is a fight with a lot of the storyline to watch, but we'll see what happens here. And if Pereira too, this could be a big moment for him to once again build up that fan base in North America to become a star that the UFC needs, especially at this weight class of 205 pounds.
Well, I think that Pereira, he has had such a storybook career in the UFC with the wins and losses and the changes to his career and the rivalries. And I think that a win this weekend would actually give him some stability that we haven't really seen since he got up to that title position against Adesanya. And, there's nothing to take away from him. I mean, like, winning a fight and then losing a title fight and then moving weight classes doesn't mean that you're struggling. But I mean, obviously that's not the stability that you see with someone having a longer title reign. I think that even though he is the champion, a win this weekend would really be that sort of, okay, this is your king of light heavyweight. This is someone who, after the division was so unstable for years, with champions winning the belt and then relinquishing it and then winning it and then having it stripped and then winning it and then losing it, we will finally have someone who we can totally call, maybe for the first time, I guess, since the Jones era, the person who can actually stay on top of the division. Because it's insane to me that, the Jan Blachowicz fight, that was 4 years ago, and really since then the division has been in turmoil. So we'll see, can Alex Pereira stay as the king of light heavyweight? I think that's the question.
I think that's a big question, and I think if he comes through with flying colors in this fight, it's massive for the UFC, because this was their marquee division for so long, with the Chuck Liddells, John Jones, as you mentioned before, and now Pereira. He could be that guy to really be the boogeyman of 205 pounds. So for the UFC's stake, and I think for Pereira's marketability too, I think this would be a huge moment for him and for the UFC. Jack, when you look at this card too, we talk about how deep it is. Obviously, former champions on here. You have Cody Garbrandt, Davison Figueiredo opening this thing up, Jessica Andrade on here, Yuri Prohaska, Charles Oliveira, Max Holloway, et cetera, et cetera. What's your biggest what's the biggest story for you? Who's got the most, I guess I should say, who's got the most to gain after UFC 300 is in the books?
Oh, geez. I mean, that is a really good question. I think that it's so hard to pick one, and if we can cycle through a few of these, that would be perfect. I think...
Yeah, for sure. I can do that for you.
Yeah, I want to start with the first fight of the card, Davison Figueiredo versus Cody Garbrandt. What I think is so interesting about this fight, I've seen some people online saying, oh, I don't like Figueiredo's odds here, and some people saying, oh, I don't like Cody Garbrandt's odds. And when I see both those statements, that means it's a really good fight. And, I think that what's great about this fight is we have two guys who have really come through a big part of their career, and, people would say that Garbrandt is off his peak, and Figueiredo is, after the numerous title fights he had, it would be understandable if he's also off his peak. But both these guys still have potential in the division. They still have pop in their punches. They're still really entertaining fighters. I think that this is a big fight to show, out of those two, who can really succeed right now. And Figueiredo being at bantamweight, moving to bantamweight just recently, this will be a really interesting test for him against one of the more interesting bantamweights. And also, as a side note, I'm really curious just how many people they'll be fighting in front of. Will this be an early arriving crowd, knowing that this is a stacked start-to-finish card, or will we get the classic Vegas crowd and an amazing fight will be in front of maybe a couple thousand?
I think minus 100 would be the classic Vegas crowd. But you know what? There's a good amount of, as you said, talent on here, so maybe a little bit more sparse than it normally would be. But yeah, I think this fight is going to be interesting because Figueiredo made his debut at 135 pounds, which I feel is like the best weight class for him. Seemed like he was killing himself to make 125 pounds. He was killing himself. I've heard people that have trained with him before saying, like, this guy is a flyweight. Like, he's walking around 145 pounds around, maybe even a little bit bigger than that. So this is the perfect weight class for him. And I thought Cody Garbrandt's last fight back in last December at UFC 296 against Brian Kelleher, that was the Cody Garbrandt of old, where he was finding that form, making his way to win the title from Dominic Cruz. And then obviously he's had some bad luck. Obviously, the title losses to TJ Dillashaw, some injury in there, but he looked like the best form that we can see of himself. And that, I think, is what intrigues me the most about this fight is if Cody can keep it on the feet and tag Figueiredo, I think it's going to be a successful night. But if Figueiredo's he can use his overall game, and if that power translates from 125 to 135 pounds, that's going to be a big factor as well. But I think it's a big fight for both guys in arguably the most stacked division in the UFC, Jack.
Now, I want to talk about two fights here because I'm really interested in how these two fights play out and how they play out in the future. I want to go back to near the top of the card and talk about Justin Gaethje and Max Holloway, and Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. What interests me is I was listening to, I think it was Dave Meltzer or someone talking about these fights, and he said that he thinks that if Justin Gaethje wins, he might be up next for a fight against Makhachev. But what interests me is that Oliveira, he was supposed to fight Makhachev, and it was an injury that took him out of that title fight. So I guess what really makes me interested about these matchups is what type of performance will Gaethje have, will Oliveira have, could possibly Tsarukyan have, and how will that play out in the title picture? I think people are sleeping on the title implications that those two fights right there have, even if Gaethje is facing someone in Max Holloway who's moving up a division, and that fight arguably doesn't have a lot of high stakes.
I think for Max Holloway, too, though, if he wins that fight, there's potential title implications for him at 145 pounds to get back the crown he lost. If he wants to go back down, maybe he's kind of comfortable at 155 pounds because that door seems to be open now at 145, especially for Holloway. He lost 3 times to Volkanovski. He was running that division, and now that door is open with Ilia Topuria being the champion. UFC wants to go to Spain. What better way to go to Spain with Topuria having his first title defense? If that's the plan, then a former champion and Max Holloway, who would be coming off this win and being the BMF champion.
But I guess my thing, and maybe this is a hot take, I don't know, but I just feel like Holloway doesn't need at 145 to prove anything. Like, I think that if you took a clean slate of if you canceled all the fights right now and said, okay, who's next for a title shot, I would say it has to be Max Holloway. So I don't necessarily know if winning or losing a fight at 155, in my opinion, changes that. Like, I think that even if he loses this fight against Gaethje, that's a fight up a division. You can't really say that factors into the featherweight picture. He would still, in my opinion, be one of the best suited guys for a title shot.
This is also the UFC where that logic doesn't matter sometimes, Jack.
Right, no, that's true.
They're gonna put, if he wins this fight, it'll be, oh, he's the BMF champ. He's the baddest MFer out there. He's got to fight our, new up and coming star in Spain. I could totally see them doing that. And Holloway's at the point of his career, like he has to be in these big title fights or fights with some meaning, like here with Gaethje. Like he can't just be fighting, as great as the performance was against Calvin Kattar at the Apex, he can't be having those anymore at this stage of his career. There has to be out there fighting in big fights for titles in front of big crowds. And I think if a win that would happen, I would see him fighting for the featherweight title. If he wants to stay at 145 too, that's also, I think, a big factor in this. But I've seen Justin Gaethje probably say as well, he wins this fight, he could be next in line for Islam Makhachev. However, I just saw him today say that I believe Makhachev wants that fight in June for International Fight Week. Gaethje doesn't seem like he wants the fight then. He would like it for later in the summer, July and August. And fair point, because the way this fight seems like it's going to go, Jack, it's just going to be a total car crash. The time and effort you put into a training camp and the amount of recovery that's going to probably, and I think what the UFC is hoping for happen, is going to be a long amount of time off that Justin Gaethje may need. And as well Holloway too.
I think UFC has to sit down Makhachev and say that June is a little unrealistic for any of these guys to face him. My question for you is, I've had some sort of I've grappled with this Gaethje-Holloway match because, I think it is obviously an incredible matchup. It is a great matchup for this type of card where you're celebrating people and you're putting together dream matches. But I feel like it kind of throws a wrench in the plans of two different divisions where you need a title contender. How do you feel about this matchup and how it affects lightweight and featherweight? As much as I think it's a great matchup, I'm grappling with that.
I think for me, the UFC for a while hasn't cared about that first and foremost. They just want to put on the best fights. And this is the fight that got the fight fans really salivating about, like, ooh, UFC 300. Okay, this is a card. This is a fight I need to see. I need to see the wildness of Justin Gaethje versus, the durability and the output that a Max Holloway can bring to the table here. Does it affect the divisions? Yes, but the UFC's kind of sometimes just going by the seat of their pants and how they want to go with these divisions. Like Bilal Muhammad should probably be getting the next welterweight title shot. He is nowhere near in the running to be getting a shot at Leon Edwards for that welterweight title. So I don't think that's too big of a discussion. I think it's just what quality of a fight we're going to get out here, and then that's where the UFC will kind of play it out here. As unfair as that is for everyone else at both 145 and 155.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I'm looking at it from too much of a fairness angle. I mean, I think that any world where Bilal Muhammad doesn't get a title shot next, and we're probably living in that world, is an unfair one. And sadly, that's just how they operate sometimes.
And that is exactly how they operate here. And as well, you were talking about, Arman Saruki and Charles Oliveira. I feel like this is kind of a fight, Jack, that's flying a little bit under the radar, for Charles Oliveira here. Obviously, the former champion coming off a massive run, had a nice bounce back win against Beneil Dariush back at UFC 289. Was supposed to have that Islam fight. Obviously, that fell through because of the injury to him. But now he gets his chance to get back in that title contention here against Arman Saruki, a guy a lot of people feel like should be a champion by the end of 2024, if not early 2025.
Yeah, this is a really stellar fight. One of the best contender fights you can make in the lightweight division easily. And it's easy for fights on this card to go under the radar, to be honest. There's so many things that people are discussing at once. For something like this to go under the radar, it's no slight on either of them. It's just kind of how this weekend is going to pan out for a lot of people. I think that, like I said before, this could be a title implication fight. I mean, a lot of it, I think, depends on availability, performance, hype. There is a lot to prove at lightweight this weekend. And as much as Oliveira, I think, is super close to a title fight, a performance here from Saruki on that can give him a win. He has a really solid case too. You look at his track record. He has a lot of wins at lightweight. He's very tested. He's very proven. And I don't think people would be upset if after a win over Oliveira, especially if it was a very solid win, we could be seeing him up next for the title.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of options at 155. Another deep division. I mean, Dustin Poirier threw his ring into that hat one more time with his win over Benoit Saint Denis back at UFC 299 just last month in Miami, Florida. And when we look at this card too, Jack, obviously these big 100, 200 events, they had massive co-main events. The co-main event here at UFC 300, I think it's an excellent fight. It's a historic fight here as Weili Zhang defends her UFC strawweight title against Yan Xiaonan here. Two Chinese fighters fighting for UFC title, but no one is talking about this fight. It almost feels like this is a fight that UFC should have just saved for when they return back to China at some point this year, because then it would have the flagship look of itself. This is the problem when you stack these cards. This fight is definitely drowning on the depth of this card.
It is a stellar matchup. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of people really wrote off Zhang after she had her first title reign ended, especially because she had a quick finish loss and then she lost a decision. And, it's hard to look at those. Like, I think that she was thought of as a very complete, almost perfect fighter for the division. And then after those losses, people really reassessed how they felt about her. But when you watch the performances she's been having since the return from those two losses, she has looked like her old self again. She is a very stellar fighter. And I think that if you are someone who considers yourself a hardcore MMA fan, or someone who, is into the skilled fighters, the most high level fighters, you have to be hyped about this fight. I mean, Zhang is a great talent, and Yan, even though she is being listed as a big underdog in this fight, is also a really well put together fighter. I think that the losses she took in recent years did take some stock off her, and I think that's why people are doubting her a little more. But I think that she's still going to give Zhang a big challenge, and I think that this is a matchup that could steal the show. It wouldn't be the first time that a women's strawweight title fight stole the show in the co-main event spot of a pay-per-view. I mean, that's sort of the whole story of Zhang's career, is that she has performances that have stolen shows even when the spotlight wasn't necessarily meant for her. So,
and that's why I think we're not talking about this fight enough. There's so much at stake, and I think as well, not only is Weili Zhang's title on the line, but I think some nationalistic pride between the two women is out there. Both want to, represent their country very well. They're very proud Chinese athletes. And, as you were saying as well, for Yan Xiaonan, I think she's coming off the best performance she had almost a year ago here against Amanda Lemos in a fight I think no one gave her a chance on. And she went out there and got the finish in devastating fashion in that first round. Against Jesse Andrade. Impressive performance there. But it's almost been a year off. Like, how much can she improve against someone here, against Weili Zhang? I think that's a big factor as well.
She's going to have to put on one of the best performances of her career, and she's going to have to shock a lot of people. But as you just mentioned, she has scored shocking wins before, so it wouldn't be a first-time thing for her. I think that this is an interesting fight when you talk about how the growth of MMA has been in China. I think every sector of every business wants to break into China because it's such a huge market. But breaking into a country isn't just giving it a little attention and doing this and that. A lot of it is luck-based. A lot of it is investment-based. UFC has really heavily tried to invest in China, putting a performance institute there, really focusing on Asia as a whole with their Road to UFC series. It's something that they truly want to get success in. And even though neither of these fighters came from the PI or that tournament, and you're not going to see any of those fighters in a tournament position for a long time because that's really two new projects. Yeah. I think that this is a fight where if they really put it on a pedestal and try to really hype it to China as, hey, look, this country produces high-level fighters and is really some of the top names in the UFC, this could be a big marketing opportunity for them.
I think it definitely is probably being used as a catalyst for that, because I mean, even though it's not getting the love it should get probably, and what the UFC's done with China for a major sporting franchise in North America, I'd say they'd have the best success out of anyone, whether, your WWE, NFL, NBA. I think you have to give the UFC the biggest props on that. And hopefully for their sake, they can use it for a driving tool to attract more, not only just Chinese fighters, but Chinese female fighters to come through and continue to grow the brand out there in China, Jack. And as we look at this card as well, it's going to kick off the main card: Cody Brundage versus Bo Nickel. First of all, Jack, are you one of those people that's upset that Bo Nickel's kicking this off? Because that's a big thing through the MMA Twitter sphere. It's like, oh, Bo Nickel, he's opening the card. How dare they? But I'm like, hey, this is a good marketing point for a prospect that has all the tools of the trade to be one of the biggest names in this sport.
Guys, if you tune in early, you're going to see all the fights. You don't need to worry about the card placement. Right. You will, like, I think card placement, like, it's fun to complain about sometimes, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. And if you're going to try to promote someone and make him a star, which, if you haven't been paying attention, UFC clearly has been trying to do with Bo Nickel since the very first time they ever laid their hands on him. It is so obvious that this is just like a promotional showcase matchup for him. You see on boxing cards, 4-0, 5-0 fighters getting put high on the card in swing bouts so that, like, hey, you can showcase your skills against a crowd that's filing in and, paying attention. I don't see a huge deal in this. I think it'll be an interesting showcase. It'll probably be a win for Bo Nickel. I don't really think there's much to say about this fight itself. But, I think having him on the card is interesting. And as much as the card placement is like a fun water cooler debate, I don't think it really matters.
I haven't checked the betting odds, but I would believe Bo Nickel is probably one of, if not the biggest betting odds going into this fight. So I'm looking
at Tapology right now, and they have him at a whopping minus 2,500,
which is astronomical advantage here for.
If you're gonna bet on him, and you only have like $10, expect try to figure out how you're gonna celebrate with the 5 cents or whatever you're getting back on that return.
Right. Yeah, hopefully maybe some Subway fare home or something like that.
Yeah,
wherever you're watching this event. But I would say, as we talked about, who's got the most to gain. If Bo Nickel were to lose, and it could be a very long shot, I would say he has the most to lose. This is well guarded, the toughest test he's going to face in the UFC up to this point in Cody Brundage, a guy with, a lengthy run here in the UFC. He's, a 500 fighter in the UFC, but he's got wins. He's coming off a first-round finish over Zach Reese, who was coming off that's Reese's first loss as a professional. Obviously, Reese doesn't have the credentials in terms of wrestling that Bo Nickel does have. But if Nickel were to lose and maybe overlook Brunch, I don't think he will. But if he were, that's a huge knock in the stock of Nickel. And you know what? UFC can then pivot a little bit to Cody Brundage, this big giant killer.
Yeah, and, I think that I'm not too worried about the spotlight sort of hurting Nickel. I mean, he comes from that wrestling background. He knows what it's like to handle the pressure on him. I think that it doesn't hurt, but it doesn't stop the build of him at all to put him in these big matchups, I think. But, I mean, when you are the guy who is expected to win, and they put you high on this card because they want to see you win, and people are calling it a showcase fight, you have everything to lose and really not much to gain, especially because if you're a 5-0 fighter, no matter how good the performance is that you have, you're going to need like 4 or 5 more of those performances before you actually get somewhere in the division. And, so yeah, you have everything to lose, but I mean, these are the fights you have to go through. And this is paying your dues, to use a wrestling term. And, if he has a good performance, really, he doesn't even have to have an amazing performance. If he just wins, this is one of those fights where it's early in his career. If he has a lousy decision, people will forget about it. They'll put him in another pay-per-view fight. It's not the end of the world. Winning is all that really matters to Bo here. But he does, like you said, the pressure's on him. No one if Brundage loses this fight, no one's going to go, oh, Brundage really squandered that opportunity. People are just going to be like, oh, okay, that was expected. So, yeah.
And as we move down the card here, because we talked about how deep it is, I mean, these prelims are crazy, but we're also getting a couple of debuts. One fighter making a debut in a weight class in Aljamain Sterling, the former bantamweight champion, making the debut at 145 pounds against Calvin Kattar, which is just a crazy fight in its own right. Jack, this is I think if we're talking about who's got the most to gain here, even I think a good performance here for Aljamain Sterling at 145 pounds is a win for him. Obviously, a win, whether it's decision or a finish, is fantastic. But to put on a fight, a high-level fight, and a quality performance, against a Calvin Kattar, I think does prove how quality of a fighter that Aljamain Sterling is. And maybe he can win some of those fans back that hated him during his run as bantamweight champion.
Yeah, I was always a little puzzled by why he had such a strong like hater base during his bantamweight run. I mean, I don't necessarily understand what placed him as a villain or how he maintained that for so long, but I think that the move up to featherweight is really interesting. This is a really solid first test for him. Like I think that if you are thinking of, okay, former champion, moving out of division after losing his belt, what's the type of fight that you give him that isn't biting off more than he can chew? Something like this. You know, it's a fight where he could lose, he could really get challenged, but this is also, we're not saying this is too much for him after coming off the bantamweight run. It's too little for him. This is like the perfect match you can make for him. I'm really curious how he's going to do in his performance, how he's going to look at featherweight, and what would be next for him after this win. Featherweight's a really interesting division when you look at the title picture, and I don't think a win here would necessarily put him in the title picture, but I think it's just the way the queue and the lineup looks at that division is so interesting right now. And once you factor in Aljamain Sterling, it just becomes even more interesting. So talking about matchmaking after this is going to be so interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and as well, Calvin Kattar, a guy that's been right there. He gets a win over a former champion and sure the division below at bantamweight. That puts him right in the mix, and I think that's what's making featherweight so interesting, because it's in this new Tapori area. A lot of challengers here and a lot of opportunities for the fighters and for the UFC to matchmake to make this division, be really exciting as this year progresses here for this promotion. And as well, we're talking about debuts in weight classes and debuts in the promotion. Kayla Harrison making her UFC debut and her bantamweight debut against former champion in Holly Holm. Jack, how excited are you to see Kayla Harrison as a member of the Ultimate Fighting Championship roster? And how curious are you to see her for her first time ever at 135 pounds?
Curiosity is the word that defines this fight for me. Yes. And the questions are going to start tomorrow during the weigh-ins, when Kayla Harrison is going to have to hit a weight that she has never hit before in her Olympic career, in her MMA career. She was talking about how much she hated hitting featherweight and how she would prefer to fight as a lightweight in the PFL. She's going 10 pounds lighter here. Now, I was really concerned when I heard about this fight at first, but she did say, she's done test cuts and stuff like that. But I feel like even with all that, in the mind, you cannot say that you aren't interested to see how is she going to hit this weight? How is she going to look? Is she going to look, normal, dehydrated, drained, whatever? How is she going to fight at that weight? I think it's really interesting to see her in the UFC. It's going to be, intriguing because she is entering a division where you don't need to, slay a ton of beasts to get to a title fight. Bantamweight is a pretty shallow division, and maybe after a performance this weekend, we could see her elevated as like another star that UFC wants to use to keep that division alive. Or Holly Holm could be a throwback Holly Holm and be a star killer tonight, like we've seen her so many times before. You never know. I mean, this is I think if UFC wanted to make a sort of do or die matchup for Harrison, it is this one right here, no doubt.
Well, I think the UFC, they're definitely putting Kayla Harrison in the deep end of the pool early as she makes her UFC debut. But Kayla seems like the person that kind of wants this fight. But, when we look at this card, Jack, it's like a lot of fighters have a lot of pressure on them, especially in the title fights. I don't think there's a fighter on this card that has as much pressure as Kayla Harrison, because it's almost like she not only has to prove she can make the weight on the scale, she has to live up to the Kayla Harrison we saw in the PFL, crushing girls in those tournaments at 145 pounds and even 155 pounds on occasion. And if she loses, it's just going to be the fan base like, oh, just another, PFL. She was just fighting women below her and she's not that good, yada, yada, yada. So I feel like Kayla is a girl and a woman that thrives on this kind of environment. So I think she's up for it. But man, I don't want to see the social media. If Holly Holm does what she, as you said before, Jack, can do, she can, have the big performance and that throwback win and, knock off Kayla Harrison, her UFC debut.
I think that PFL did a really great job of building up Harrison, and I think that people will discount the type of matchups they gave her, but realistically, when you take someone who had never fought in MMA before her PFL run, you have to sort of bubble wrap her to start and give her these fights to see, okay, how are you going to do against these other matchups, which, will test your skill level. But, you are going to see that discourse if she loses this fight of, how good is she really? People are going to be saying that type of stuff. I think that she has a lot to lose in this match, and even though she's going to get paid, she could lose her reputation. And some people don't care about their reputation, but if she cares about her reputation, I think this is a huge fight for her. If she comes out of this weekend making bantamweight, having a good fight, beating Holly Holm, I think she will, in the minds of a lot of doubters, be a pretty legit fighter. I think she's a legit fighter, obviously. If you've seen her fight, you know that even if she's facing a lot of people who aren't of a similar skill level as her, you can see the technical skills in her work. But that skeptics, if she does have a good performance this weekend, will possibly change their mind. If she has a bad performance, they will only be louder skeptics, and they will be more confident in their points.
The biggest thing I think for Kayla Harrison in this fight, obviously she has to make the weight. Seeing some pictures of her, she does look in great shape here before she hits the scales now in about 24 hours as we're talking. But Jack, she can use elbows again. And she's only had to use elbows in one fight, and that was that offshoot fight in 2020 in Invicta when the PFL shut down that season because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Courtney Casey, that was just an absolute Courtney King. That was a murder, almost a crime scene in the Invicta cage. That's a big benefit for her that she hasn't had the opportunity to use, and now she can use again and use that judo level, get the fight to the ground, and go to town with those elbows.
Yeah, and I think that one thing coming out of this fight, which I think is going to be interesting, is like, no matter whether she wins or loses, I'm going to be curious, like, what's her schedule going to be like going forward? She has for years been under the PFL schedule of fighting 4 times per year under very strict scheduling where they don't say, okay, we need you to fight 4 times, but like any time within this window. They say, no, you're fighting on this card, and then 8 weeks later, you're fighting on this card, and there's no negotiations of, well, can I do a week later, like before? And then the playoffs get decided for you, the finals get decided for you. For the first time in Harrison's MMA career, since she joined, I think it was like the 2019 season, she is going to be deciding sort of what her schedule is going to be like in MMA. She did that last year when she wasn't in the season and she fought just once. Are we going to be seeing her as a once-a-year fighter? Is she going to be very active? Like, I'm just curious, like, where in Harrison's career are we going to see her, especially when she is making that cut to 135 as opposed to higher?
I could see her being the once-a-year fighter because she is 33 years old. She's a proud mother, and I think she's enjoyed the family time as much as, the gym and the training and everything like that. And you know what? Make her be a little bit special. Like, if she has a big performance here, make her be that special. She is a name. She does have a great fan base behind her. She can cut one heck of a promo. She can sell a fight through the media. Why not make her be a once-a-year kind of a fighter and, that special attraction, especially here for some of these women's weight classes where you feel like they kind of need them, and Kayla Harrison is a blessing to come to the UFC. She's always wanted to be a champion. I think a win here, too, would probably catapult her, if not to get a title shot or one fight away from a title fight, Jack.
Totally, yeah. I like your idea of keeping her as a special attraction fighter. And I think that if she wins this, you should really push her into those big fights, especially because at 33 years old, after her years in the PFL, after her athletic career before then, I don't know how much she actually, what is her goal in the UFC? Does she want to do a few fights and then call it a career? Does she want to have a really long run? No matter what, I think that the logical thing here is to say, Kayla Harrison, we're going to try to make you one of the big names in the division. We're going to move you into those big fights. And we're going to make you that sort of special attraction where when you're on a card, people go, whoa, I haven't seen her in a while. I want to see how she does.
Plus, you know what the UFC loves to do? Take fighters from other organizations that have a bit of a name behind them and make them like bigger stars. They've done it with Michael Chandler, and like obviously they have to win their fights because sometimes it doesn't work out. But they've done it with Michael Chandler recently. They would love, I think, nothing more than to just make Kayla Harrison 10 times a bigger star than she ever was when she was with the PFL, and have her catapult and skyrocket. And she's got an incredible story too. I could totally see that. But she does have to get by Holly Holm. We can't discredit what Holly Holm brings to the table. A very talented fighter here in Harrison's debut at 135 pounds. Jack, when you look at this card too, as we'll wind this chat down quickly, I mean, there's a lot of great fights. Still some stories we haven't touched on. I mean, Jim Miller trying to be get a win at UFC 100, 200, and 300 here against Bobby Green in a fight that should be crazy in its own right. But there's some good little prospect fights out here. Obviously, Jalen Turner and Renato Moicano, Sadiq Youssef and Diego Lopez. That one just screams like that could be fight of the night and how deep this card is. Is there a fight in particular you've been looking at that maybe isn't getting enough attention from people that you feel like this one's going to bring eyeballs to the table and, make people just want to have to see it?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that featherweight fight with Diego Lopez. I think Lopez is a really interesting name to watch. He's coming off a pair of first-round finishes, and if he can continue that on this card, he will be one of those names that will be discussed coming out of the weekend. But when talking about the undercard in general, the biggest fight that sticks out to me has to be Yuri Prochazka facing Alexander Rakic. This is a fight where Prochazka is trying to rebound after really being out of the title picture for the first time in a while, and he's facing someone in Rakic who, for years, has been hovering around the top half of the rankings and has been always saying that he's ready for that title fight. But I think people would unanimously agree he hasn't really done that one performance or had that big moment that has made people say it's time for him to get pushed into the title picture. He just hasn't gotten in. He just hasn't gotten there yet. But he's facing Prochazka. He's facing a former champion. He's facing one of the biggest names in the division and someone who, despite not being a champion and despite having a pretty short UFC run, I would argue he actually has a pretty decent amount of buzz around him. Prochazka is a really interesting character. He has some charisma to him. He's a really wild fighter. He is someone who people really do tune in to watch. And if Rakic is able to win here, I think he has a stronger case than ever in the light heavyweight division. He will be easily on his best run so far as a UFC fighter. But also another question heading into this has to be, how is Yuri going to recover? It's a really, really interesting fight, and I think it is rightfully in the top prelim position. It is the perfect fight to send people off into the pay-per-view portion of the card with.
Well, I think your point, how does Yuri recover? Because it's always interesting to see how a fighter bounces back, especially after a knockout. Like we were questioning how would Alex Volkanovski be when he bounced back after the knockout that he had from Islam Makhachev. Didn't go so well, losing his featherweight championship. How is Yuri Prochazka going to bounce back? But as well, we were talking about Jamal Hill. How's he going to recover after almost a year off? How is Rakic going to recover after almost 2 years away from fighting inside the cage or inside the octagon? That is a long layoff. I know fighters say that cage rest isn't a thing. I don't agree with that necessarily. There may be some cage rest here. I know Rakic is fighting, the cream of the crop guys at light heavyweight before he went away, and that division is totally different from the last time he stepped inside the octagon. But that's a big question as well. How is Rakic going to recover here? Has the time off going to been really good for him, or will he have some of that cage rust against one of the most flashiest and most unorthodox fighters in the entire organization in Yuri Prochazka?
It's an incredible fight, and I think that I feel like I'm repeating myself so many times because so many fights meet this criteria of being one of the best fights you can make in that division. This is easily one of the best fights at light heavyweight you could make right now. And there's just so many questions heading into it. It very much mirrors what you're seeing in the main event with the light heavyweight title picture when you talk about, what you mentioned about coming back from injury and, having someone who is, very unpredictable and you don't really know how the fight could go and it's very hard to call. That's one I'm really interested in. If I can just mention one more fight, I think that, you mentioned the Jim Miller fight and storyline-wise, that's great. Can he finish the story and get that UFC 100, UFC 200, UFC 300 win? It would be a total bummer if he can't get that final one. But his appearance on this card alone is a testament to the length, the longevity, and the success of his career. But when we talk about a great fight at strawweight, Jessica Andrade, Marina Rodriguez, two names who are killers in the division. They've taken some losses. They haven't necessarily been perfect in recent years, but they are two names who put on some of the best fights at strawweight. And for the third fight of the evening, that's a pretty damn good bout.
That is a damn good bout. I think there's a lot of great fights. I mean, for Jim Miller, if he wins this fight against Bobby Green, which should be a fantastic fight, I could see Miller wrapping up the career. I mean, what a way to go out with wins at UFC 100, Perfect. 200, 300. You've had the most fights in the history of the UFC. You've got some records that I don't think will ever be touched in terms of fighting for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. That would be crazy. I think I'm really looking at the Sadiq Youssef Diego Lopez fight. Lopez is just He's really starting to make a name for himself as a elite level featherweight. You know, the Brazilian who spent a lot of his time in the regional scene out in Mexico. That finish of Pat Sabatini back in November at UFC 295 in Madison Square Garden, I think took his name to another level against someone like Sadiq Youssef, who's really had this renaissance breakthrough, more so through his social media content, but really can still put on a great level of a performance. Yes, he's coming off the loss to Edson Barbosa, but he looked really good in that fight up until you got into the late in the third round, up to championship rounds in that 5-round main event here. I think it's a big must-have fight for Youssef, but as well for Lopez. He would be just another Mexican stud that the UFC would have in their stable if he could come away with a win here.
Well, what's interesting about Lopez is, I mean, he debuted against Movsar Evloev, and that is quite the tough assignment for your very first fight. And I don't know if people took some stuff away from him due to losing his debut, but that's a really tough name to face in your first UFC fight. Beating Gavin Tucker, Pat Sabatini, these are not, title contender guys, but they are really legit names in the division, and he put away both of them in under 2 minutes each. So, I mean, he is someone to watch, and even though this card is less prospect and more contender, this is a great prospect fight to put lower in the lineup.
It also looks like, when you just look at it, it's like the UFC trying to repair and pave the way for some divisions. Like we talked about light heavyweight, really solidify that, get that division healthy again. Obviously, women's strawweight, try to develop a star into women's bantamweight with Kayla Harrison. And of course, featherweight, trying to get some new contenders here for Ilia Topuria down the line. Really, one of my last things here for you, Jack. Obviously, this card is amazing in terms of depth and some name value, but more so the depth and the quality of fights you're going to get. Like, I think if you're going to pay for this paper, your money's not going to be wasted. But the machine of the UFC continues, and when we go look at the remaining pay-per-views here, Jack, you think the UFC is kind of hurting themselves a bit by so loading this UFC 300 event as we head on to other pay-per-views. Obviously, May 4th is UFC 301 in Brazil. I mean, when you look at the level of what our main event is here, sure, it's the men's flyweight title, Alejandro Pantoja against Steve Erceg. A good fight, but is that worthy being a pay-per-view fight? And then when we look at what's coming up for UFC 302 in Newark, New Jersey, I mean, we don't have a main event yet, but still, like, do you feel like the UFC just did too much here to hurt themselves for a little bit as we hit the summer?
It's hard to tell right now. I mean, I think it's something we're certainly going to have a better picture of as the months play out. I think how that 302 main event ends up becoming is really, I think, going to be the testament to how much they overbooked these past 2 months, because 299 also had tons of stars on it too. That was a lineup which very much is a very honorable silver medal compared to the gold medal of UFC 300. It was a stellar lineup. So really, I think what that 302 main event ends up being is going to be our sort of verdict on if they overbooked these past 2 months. 301, it's kind of a hard example to use because when UFC heads to Brazil, they very much want to make that main event a Brazilian fighter in a title fight, and that does limit you, especially when you do put Alex Pereira on this card. That takes one of your few Brazilian champions out of the scheduling. And when you work within those limitations that they want to only make a Brazilian title fight, you really want to have a few options. So it's hard to say with that card how much they have messed up their scheduling. But yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's going to be an issue now. We might have some not so great pay-per-views in the future, but looking back, we're not going to think about that. We're going to be talking about how UFC 300 was a stacked card. In 5 years, you're going to get those social media posts of 5 years ago today, we had one of the greatest, strongest looking cards on paper of all time. And no one's ever going to be going, oh, well, it messed up like a few months of pay-per-views after. I think it's worth it, in my opinion, if you ask me, to create a card like this, of this quality. You're sacrificing maybe a month or so of pay-per-view programming, but I do think you are creating a memorable thing to celebrate really an impressive number of events, something which started in 1993 and is all the way now in 2024. I think it's a sacrifice that is worth it.
Well, we'll see if it is going to be worth it. Obviously, as you said, they're building that Brazil market up, and they always do. And nothing's going to live up to the hype after 300 as you go into 301. And that was probably going to be a sacrificial lamb anyway. But
Totally.
I think to a lot of people's takes, it's just like the quality of UFC events throughout this year is like, while the pay-per-views have been stacked, and that's maybe the most important thing, overall it hasn't had the same. But you have so many fighters, you're going to have Contender Series, a new boatload of fighters coming in once that begins. Ultimate Fighter is going to come through. Like, there's going to be things that people will watch as we hit this busy weekend and busy year once again for the UFC, where many events are coming up here, Jack. And I know you're looking forward to this event. I'm looking forward to this event. And you're going to be breaking it down after the fact with John Pollock on Post Wrestling on Sunday morning. Jack, for the people that don't know where they can find your content, where can people contact you or check out your social media?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on today. It was great to chat fights with you.
Yeah.
So yeah, me and John Pollock, 11 a.m. Sunday, we're going to do that quick turnaround, get a few hours of sleep in, then wake up and talk fights on the Post Wrestling YouTube channel. So go on YouTube, type in Post Wrestling. They do mostly wrestling stuff, but they also cover the big UFC events, and we're going to be having a free podcast on their YouTube channel and their podcast feeds. If you want to follow my work, I'm a little all over the place. I'm doing freelance stuff. I have, it's hard to keep track of it all. Best way to do that is to follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/Jack Wannan, just like you see on the nameplate here. That's how you spell it. Jack Wannan on Twitter. That's how you can follow me. And yeah, I mean, that's the best way to keep track of my stuff. So thanks again for having me on.
Well, thank you very much, Jack, for taking your time out of your busy schedule to chat some UFC 300 and a little bit of AEW with me, as well as we head into the deepest and most stacked UFC card in history this Saturday with UFC 300.